Hi guys, welcome back to another instalment of my constant reader journey through the complete works of Stephen King. This time I am taking a look at a late 90s psychological thriller that doesn't get a lot of attention, and that is The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. I'll be getting into my thoughts and feelings on the story. It doesn't have an adaptation, so we could do some brainstorming at the end to see what that would look like. If you enjoy this video, remember to like, comment and subscribe. I've got so many more Stephen King stories to still look at, and you'll be the first one to know when I'm talking about the next one. This was, I think, my least favourite book that I've read from King so far. I'm somewhat surprised that it achieved a solo publish, because it felt more like a novella than a novel. It was like, oh, you would compile this into a collection, like different seasons or 4 Past Midnight. I'm very surprised that this was like sold on its own. Like, one of the most common criticisms that Stephen King gets about his books is that they're too long. He's usually a maximalist. He crams so much into a single story. So I could see why some readers would enjoy this more sort of stripped back approach, but for me at least, it was too simple. It was too monotonous. Little girl gets lost in the woods. That is in fact the whole book. It never evolves. It never properly crescendos, in my opinion. There's no shocking twists. It just sort of happens and then it's over. I think King during the 90s and the early noughties was very big on suspense thrillers and giving the reader that sort of slow burn. But in this, the stakes were so low, and it was all from the mind of a single character. So there was no opportunity to build relationships or have complex dialogue. At least in a story like Misery, for instance, you have the themes of abduction and entrapment. But here, Tricia McFarland in the woods, she could have stumbled upon literally anything. The possibilities were endless. I wanted her journey to be more fantastical, introduce spirits and folklore creatures, give us some escapism, rather than what almost felt like a sort of stale attempt at a coming-of-age story. Maybe if I read this when I was a bit younger, I might feel some sort of nostalgia towards it. But I think because I'm going through all of Stephen King's works in succession, I can't help but compare it to what I've already read, and so this novel feels very C tier. Like, it fades into the background when you look at his other, classics. It's very much a blink and you'd miss it kind of story from him. Maybe I'm being too harsh. I'm not saying you can't enjoy it. There were bits of it as well that I did like, and I will get into them. I don't think it helps that there are so many references to baseball, the Red Sox, Tom Gordon. Like, Tom Gordon is more of a main character than anyone else besides Tricia. Like, we don't have baseball in the UK. We have cricket and we have rounders. From what I've heard of baseball, it sounds quite ghastly. So I was never going to relate to how much Tricia loves her baseball. I'm sure if you're from New England and you love the Red Sox, then this book is like catnip. But for me, it was like she was speaking another language. Every chapter is named after an inning from baseball, and for the first few innings, I was like, I kind of enjoyed the start. Like, King, he really has a knack for illustrating children and how, like, a 9-year-old would behave. Like, Tricia is very direct. She sees things more realistically than most grown-ups because she's not encumbered by social responsibility. She doesn't have, like, a filter. She's just like, says exactly what she's thinking. You're listening to her, like, explain her parents' divorce in such a candid, matter-of-fact way that you can't help but admire her and sympathise with, like, how often she has to watch her brother and her mum argue, and, like, her having to fix all these things that are broken. And it all felt very personal, so I looked into it, and Stephen King did actually grow up in a broken home. his father walked out on his mother when he was only 2 years old, leaving him with his older brother and his mother. And that, a bit of that definitely comes across here. Like, Trisha's dad is only ever referenced in flashbacks. We don't see him until the ending, while her mum tries so hard to make her children happy. She's planned this elaborate hiking trip along the Appalachian Trail. The mum has also relocated their family from rural Massachusetts to Maine. And Trisha's older brother, Pete, he's like your typical belligerent teenager. Like, he resents the mum for moving them away, especially because at his old school he had friends, but at his new school he's been bullied because he likes computers. It felt very personal, and I appreciate that King is able to put so much of himself into all of his stories. At around 11 a.m, Pete and their mum are so distracted by their argument that they fail to notice that Trisha, she leaves the hiking path to go to the toilet in some bushes, and that's how she gets lost. Now, last year I worked as a camp counsellor at like a summer camp in Massachusetts, so I appreciate just how labyrinthine like the New England forest really is. Like, unless you're near like a large clearing or a lake, the trees are so tall you can barely see the sky. Every corner looks identical, so you do completely lose your sense of direction. And I think this is why like sleepaway camps and like other like woodland spaces, they often have alarm systems and like park rangers, because kids, if they wander off the trail for even just 5 minutes, they could easily just be lost for hours. So I understand the premise of this story. I understand why it's scary and it's relatable. But where you lose me is that the whole thing is very one-sided. My expectation, I thought, the narrative is going to go back and forth. We're going to start with Trisha getting distressed in the woods, and then we're going to go to the mum dealing with the guilt around losing her daughter on this trail, and then we'll go between them. Because often when children go missing, what makes it that much more horrifying is seeing how it affects their family, how it sort of tears the parents apart, because they might never see their kid again and they feel somewhat responsible. So I was very confused as to why we never really see that perspective. We stay with Trisha the entire time, and after a while it just begins to grate, because you're thinking like, this can't be the whole novel. But it is. It's the whole novel. Trisha encounters so many different challenges. Her food supply is dwindling. She's covered in bug bites. She encounters snakes, wasps, beavers, deers. It's a bit like Castaway, if it was a book. But because our protagonist is a 9-year-old girl, she's not developed enough as a character to feasibly carry the entire reading experience, I felt. It's similar to what I said about when I read Firestarter. Charlie McGee, too young to be captivating. So most of the book is just the grown-ups projecting onto her. And it was a similar situation here. Like, so much of Trisha's internal dialogue is quoting her parents, quoting her best friend Pepsi, talking about her brother, talking about God, talking about Tom Gordon, of course. I didn't really know by the end of the story who Trisha was, because she's just a little girl. She doesn't have her own identity yet. And so while it's nice and it's touching to see her overcome these odds and make it out the other side, I still don't really have like someone to root for, because she's just a little girl. It doesn't help as well that people going missing, particularly children, is such a worn-out Stephen King trope. It happens in Salem's Lot. It happens in It. It happens in the Tommyknockers. But at least with each of those stories, the fear factor comes from the supernatural, the abductor. In this book, it's just a case of negligent parenting. And you know by the end that Trisha will be rescued, because the book is too simple to sort of flick a crazy twist at you. And so it's very predictable in that sense. Should we talk about the villain, the god of the lost? Apparently it's analogous to the Wendigo that comes up in Pet Sematary. I was really hoping it would have more of a point, to be brutally honest. Trisha feels its presence a couple of times, but doesn't ever come head to head with it until the very end when they have like a showdown. It's described a bit like a typical black bear, but it's filled with wasps, and then Trisha sort of like hits it on the head with her Walkman, and it retreats. It was a bit of an anticlimax. I thought it would have been cooler if the God of the Lost was a shapeshifter. Like, it could transform into different people to manipulate Trisha. Like, when the police received an anonymous phone call to arrest a local paedophile in connection with Trisha's disappearance, I thought, oh, that's going to be revealed as like a diversion tactic. Like, the God of the Lost has kept the authorities away from the woods longer by being this anonymous tipper. But no, it's completely unrelated. It's, I guess, a red herring. It really had nothing to do with anything else in the story. I wanted their fight to be like the end of the Spiderwick Chronicles, when the little boy like stabs his dad because he knows it's secretly Mulgarath in disguise.
Wrong answer. Oh! What did you do? It's not Dad! What? Oh my god.
Like, Trisha spends so much time pining for her dad, Larry McFarland, and wishing that they could watch baseball together. I figured that the God of the Lost, if it could like read minds or was like very intuitive, would like try and shapeshift and deceive her. Or pretend to be Tom Gordon. That would have, in fact, yeah, pretend to be Tom Gordon. That's much more interesting. It's like a black irony sort of like twist, because like the adage of never meet your heroes, you know, she's like starstruck when she sees Tom Gordon, but then realises it's not him. And then you have that emotional growth of her being able to discern the true evil despite resembling her sports idol. Yeah, that's how it should have ended. I did enjoy the little details, though, that told you that this book was published right before the turn of the century. Like, this is the most modern King book that I've read so far, and there were lots of progressive Easter eggs that were fun to point out. Like, the fact that our main character is a small girl, but she's challenging gender stereotypes by being a bit of a tomboy and a baseball enthusiast, and she's living in this unconventional family dynamic, you know, her parents have separated, single mothers raising her. The fact that Tom Gordon in real life is a person of colour and he's the object of this young white girl's adoration. It's very new age, and I liked that. Additionally, the reliance on digital tech, the way that Trisha keeps contact with the outside world through her Walkman, and how the search for Trisha is spread via the radio. It's very ahead of its time, because I feel like kids these days depend even more so on technology. And it was refreshing to see the tech be shown as a force for good, you know, the utility of having this Walkman, as opposed to it being like, oh, kids these days, you know, they don't appreciate the great outdoors. I also feel that Stephen King does a terrific job of portraying the human psyche. There are moments in this story where Trisha's sanity is really put to the test, and all the scenes where she is hallucinating and she talks to herself or she talks to imaginary Tom Gordon, they're all very impactful. She keeps repeating jingles that she hears on her Walkman, especially the Autoglass Repair one. She keeps quoting different sayings that she remembers from her friends and her family. At some point, she even has like a sort of Henry David Thoreau moment where she like appreciates the simple wonder of the woods. She's like, oh, I'm seeing it all for the first time. Like, she has an enlightened moment. I found that was very funny. It would have been cool too if it became like Where the Wild Things Are. Like, she came into her element and decided she wanted to stay in the woods. Like, she's like a modern Mowgli. Like, that would have been fun. But no, that does not happen. After about a week of living on nuts and chesterberries. Sidebar, I did love how the ecology of New England was explored accurately and in vivid detail. Because that matters. Like, King even says in the afterword, he talked about with his friend the biodiversity that you'd expect in late winter, early spring of Maine. And you could tell there were like the names of plants and animals and things that it was like, oh, this is very specific. I appreciate that. But anyways, Trisha, she finds part of a metal gate and she follows it for miles and miles, sleeping in an abandoned van and nearly getting savaged by the god of the lost, who's actually just a bear. A man spots her and immediately recognises her as the missing child from the news, so he shoots the bear's ear, which like causes the bear to flee. And then Trisha wakes up in hospital to find her parents like crowding around her, like, oh, you're safe, you're safe. The nurse says that she's developed pneumonia, but it's very clear she'll make a recovery. She's not well enough to speak, but she does have, throughout the story, she has like this signed Tom Gordon baseball cap, and she like points to it and then points at the sky. Her dad understands that that's a reference to how Tom Gordon, when he scores a point for the Red Sox, he points to the sky. It's a very generic trademark. I think Lionel Messi does the exact same thing when he scores a goal in football, but hey, what are you going to do? But yeah, that's The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. It does not have a film or TV adaptation. I can't say I'm surprised. I do think for most of his work that is very telling, whether or not they've even talked about adapting it. I think child actors are already a very questionable industry practice in Hollywood, and if you were being book accurate, we would be spending 90 minutes following a little girl in the woods. Like, that's not... I don't think that's entertaining cinematography. There is a pop-up book version that looks fun. It's not really my thing, pop-up books. Kind of reminds me of The Babadook.
See him in your room at night.
Mom, does it hurt the boy? Mom, does it live under the bed?
But if you love this story, I could see why you'd grab the pop-up book. Why not? Again, I'm not saying you can't enjoy this book, and if you did, power to you. But I found it to be very basic and surprisingly boring to come from the mind of Stephen King. But those are my thoughts, and as always, toodaloo.